What I want to do today is that, as he mentioned, could be relatively uncomfortable. And can everybody see the slides okay? Okay, great. I want to ask you, we'll start maybe with a simple question. What would you do if you had a time machine? If you were Marty McFly or Bill and Ted or whichever, what would you do if you had a time machine? Sounds like a license to print money, right? A lot of us, I know Peter would probably go back to, maybe 1987 and short the stock market right before the crash. I mean, there's all kinds of things we could go back and do. And it's sort of an interesting thought experiment to think about, what if we really could go back in time? And the reason I ask that question is because the demographers and historians tell us that there have been about 100 billion people that have ever lived in the history of the world. Now, I don't know really how they come up with that number, but we'll just accept it for the sake of argument. 100 billion people who have ever lived. Now, 7 billion people are living today, which means there have been 93 billion people who have come and gone, and they have lessons to teach us. And so, one of the main points of this entire presentation is that I believe we should not ignore the collective wisdom of 93 billion people that have come before us. So what do they have to teach us? Well, let's look at one lesson from history. The first one is that throughout history there's always been a dominant superpower. And this dominant superpower has changed frequently throughout history. There has been no nation, no empire, no civilization that has some divine right to primacy in the world forever, indefinitely. It doesn't happen. These dominant superpowers change frequently. We can think about the Egyptians. We can think about the Persians. We can think about the Macedonians, the Romans, the Mongolians. Actually, if you look at sort of success, the Mongolians were the most successful empire to have ever existed in the history of the world simply because they conquered more of the world's known landmass at the time. The Ming Dynasty. This was the Holy Roman Empire, what many historians consider the First Reich, the Germans. The Italians, for the second time around, the Italians, first with the Romans and then with the Venetians and the Florentines, the Italians were essentially the greatest power in the world twice in history. They screwed it up twice. The Habsburg Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Français, the Germans again, second time. Oh, sorry, these are the Russians. The Brits, and there, the Germans, the second time. And then these guys. Okay? This is nothing new. And the fact that the United States is the world's greatest superpower, again, this is nothing new. This happens throughout history. We can't say that we're special, that, we're the greatest superpower in the world. This has happened so many times before. This isn't some crazy conspiracy theory. This is just historical fact. Empires rise, they peak, they decline, and they collapse. This is the cycle of history. Empires, nations, civilizations, they have a life cycle just like human beings. There is no, anybody read Shelley? My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. There is no civilization that is immune from the laws of the universe, the financial laws of the universe, the moral laws of the universe. Most of these empires throughout history have always believed that they're somehow immune. They say, oh, all that stuff that happened to those other guys. I mean, the Romans read history. The Ottomans read history. The Brits, of course, they read history. They wrote the history. Okay? And you got to imagine that the British people who were reading Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire probably thought, that's not going to happen here. And yet, it did. It always happens. And one of the other key lessons from history is that the social contract is always changing. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a famous French philosopher, he coined this phrase, the social contract, wrote a book called The Social Contract. We'll call the social contract the way that a society sort of organizes itself. And this way that a society organizes itself also frequently changes throughout history. And oftentimes it's copied. It's copied regionally, sometimes copied globally. So we have an example, sort of the feudal system. And the feudal system where you had sort of one guy at the top, a couple little henchmen down below, and then you had all these zillions of serfs who were there with their allegiance to the king. And everybody worked the land, and all the money trickled up, and what a horrible system that was, but it was copied for 1,000 years throughout the Middle Ages. And then we had the rise of the nation state. And this was a model that was copied frequently. The age of imperialism, another great example. This is when all of a sudden the great powers in Europe, followed by the United States, decided, oh, we should get out there, stretch our legs a little bit, and take over countries. This is another regional example. For many decades in the 20th century, Latin America was replete with military dictatorships, many of which were actually installed by the United States. Noriega, Galtieri, Pinochet, and so forth. Native American tribal structures, just to give you, more examples of these social contracts. This is what we have today. I call this Keynesian fiat bubble kleptocracy. This is a system that is essentially for the elite, by the elite, with this illusion that all the little people out there have some sort of control. We'll get into this a little bit more in a little bit. I want to move on to the third lesson from history, is that the global financial system is always changing. The U.S. dollar today is the world's reserve currency. What does that mean? It means that when a guy in China does business with a guy in Brazil, they exchange U.S. dollars in that transaction, although that's starting to happen less and less. The U.S. dollar is the world's reserve currency. The central bank of Kazakhstan is sitting on a big pile of U.S. dollars. Okay? That changes. Again, this is nothing new. The Byzantine solidus was something that lasted for 7 centuries as the global reserve currency. Anybody anywhere in the world was holding on to these gold coins. This is Emperor Justinian here. The Venetian gold ducat was something that came around. Venice was actually a very interesting example. Was the first European power to really pull out of what they call the Dark Ages. The Dark Ages is really a misnomer. It was only the Dark Ages in Europe because of the civilizations in the world, in China, South America. They were flourishing. It was Europe that was in this in the midst of this period where there was no intellectual movement whatsoever. And it was the Venetians that pulled out of that. The reason why they pulled out of that was something very interesting they called commenda. This is sort of the precursor to a limited liability company today. The Venetians were the ones to step up and say, we will guarantee your economic freedom. And you had all these serfs that were coming from all over Europe to Venice because they knew that if they worked hard and they were a little bit lucky, that they could actually become very wealthy and do very well for themselves. And it was actually the Venetians that were the first ones to do that. And they became the greatest power in Europe. They didn't have any resources. It's not like Venice was sitting on big piles of gold and oil or salt and all the things of the day. They didn't have any of that stuff. What they had was economic freedom. And just like Hong Kong today and the difference between North and South Korea and all these places that don't really have any resources of their own, the major difference is economic freedom. That's why Venice became the world power. And their currency essentially became the world reserve currency. The gold florin, when Venice actually went down and Florence went up, it switched. Pieces of 8, this was during the Spanish Empire, the British pound. And this is interesting, right? So you see, we haven't seen these for a long time. If you can see the slides on the top left corner, you see a $50 bill. This is one that was actually backed by gold. This is the early stages after World War II when it was clear that the United States was the dominant superpower in the world. The entire world went on the gold standard. These two gentlemen on the right, the guy on the far right, that's actually John Maynard Keynes, the father of Keynesian economics and the economic playbook that every politician draws on today. He's the guy who says it's a good idea to conjure money out of thin air, that's a consequence-free environment. He's the guy that thinks that if you just keep interest rates at 0, again, that's a consequence-free environment. He's the guy who thinks that it should be governments that are out there pulling the strings and not private markets and individuals. And so this is the system that was set up. And so what they did after World War II, actually it was before the war officially was over, they all got together in the United States and they hammered out the deal of what the new financial system would look like. And this is called the Bretton Woods system. And the Bretton Woods system essentially pegged the U.S. dollar to gold and every other currency in the world to the U.S. dollar. And so the yen was fixed at a rate and the pound was fixed at a rate. And of course the U.S. could do that because they're the only ones, left standing. Europe was decimated, Japan was decimated, everyone was decimated except the United States. So they were in a position to dictate terms in the global financial system. And they said this is going to be what it is. And then that lasted for a couple of decades, and then they switched. A new global financial system. This one's still underpinned by the dollar, but a completely different dollar. In 1971, Richard Nixon, under pressure from all sorts of external forces, huge debts, huge deficits, inflation, so forth, Nixon decided he was going to end the convertibility of the dollar to gold. So remember what I said in the Bretton Woods system, they tied the dollar to gold first, and then tied every other currency to the dollar. Well, in 1971, Nixon said, we're going to eliminate this peg to the dollar, and now the dollar is going to float freely in the marketplace. And this new term came around, they call it fiat currency. Okay? This is a very interesting thing. Fiat currency in economics basically means that your currency floats freely. Fiat is actually Latin. It comes from the verb fio. And if you might be Catholic, you might know the phrase fiat volumus Deo, which is thy will be done. sort of let it be, as in let there be light. Let there be currency. Poof! They just conjured out of thin air. Okay? And I think that's kind of ironic, really. Most people don't realize that. The system that we have today, again, guys like Keynes, the godfather of this sort of economic system that we all have, we award our faux scientists prizes for telling us that we should conjure money out of thin air. This picture here is something, if you go back 100, 150 years, they used to consider racial sciences, ethnic sciences, to be a science. They would measure the slope of somebody's forehead. They would measure the distance from their earlobe to their nose. And they would actually conclude that that would actually give you some kind of insight as to whether this person is honest or intelligent or an advanced human being or whether or not they're inferior. And back then, this was considered science. And people believed because they said, well, it's science. The scientists tell us. They back it up with all kinds of data and charts and numbers and these sorts of things. And we can look at this today and go, man, this is bullshit. I can't believe anybody would actually believe this. And yet, in the day, everyone thought it was true. This was science. Today, we have scientists who tell us, yes, conjure money out of thin air. This is a consequence-free environment. Yes, you can borrow your way out of debt. You can print your way out of recession. No problem. And today, this is science. Our scientists tell us that our system of currency, our monetary system, we call it the system of central banking, that we should give this tiny little banking elite, a handful of guys, we should give them total control over the money supply. So there's literally a couple of guys sitting in a room who decide in their sole discretion, well, what do you think? We should conjure trillions of dollars out there? Yeah, let's do that. That sounds like a good idea. So you have a couple of guys that have complete and total control of the monetary system, and we're just supposed to trust them that they're good guys and that they know what they're doing. That's what the scientists tell us. The science tells us that that's a good idea, and there is not a doubt in my mind that at some point in the future, people are going to look back, just as we look back to these people and go, I can't believe anybody believed that. People are going to look back on us and go, I can't believe those people believed that. I can't believe they thought that this economics of central banking was actually science. But this is what passes off for science. Not only does it pass off for science, we give prizes to people for this kind of stuff. We award the Nobel Prize goes to people who tell us that, you should conjure money out of thin air. Again, we award total control of the money supply to a tiny, unelected banking elite. People think that, we're living in this Republican democracy. This is not a Republican democracy when you have a bunch of unelected officials who have total control of the money supply. Thomas Jefferson said, the end of democracy and the defeat of the American Revolution will occur when government falls into the hands of lending institutions and moneyed corporations. And he was right. We're going to take a quick detour. I want to walk you guys through central banking. A lot of people have no idea. I would say most people have no idea what central banking is all about. This is something that we just sort of, there's these wizards in the tower up somewhere, and again, we're just supposed to trust that they're good guys. Nobody knows how this stuff works. Guys who make millions of dollars a year on Wall Street have no idea how this stuff works. Okay, it's actually scary. Here's the deal. Like anything else, like any market. This is a real estate group. You know all about supply and demand. In any marketplace, there's supply and demand. The supply of housing goes up and the demand falls. Guess what? The price goes down, right? Money is no different. There's a supply of money and there's demand for money. And when those two meet, where supply and demand meet, you get what? The price. Okay? The price of money is the interest rate. So what you have is a handful of people, central bankers, who control the supply of money. Okay? The demand for money comes from consumers. It comes from businesses. Actually, quite a bit of demand for money comes from governments these days. These guys are all in debt up to their eyeballs, which we'll get to. Okay, so again, the intersection of supply and demand gives you the price. So the price of money is the interest rate. If you control the supply of anything, whether you control the supply of corn or real estate or lumber or money, you control the price. It's as simple as that. And so what central bankers essentially have is control of the money supply, i.e. the control of the price of money. And when you control the price of money, you control the price of everything. Interest rates dictate the price of real estate, how high the stock market goes, where the bond market goes, what the price of oil is. Everything depends on the price of money. So what we're essentially doing is awarding this tiny banking elite with the authority to control the price of everything on the planet. The price of real estate in Hong Kong depends on what the central bank in the United States does. If they print money or they don't print money, it makes the stock market in Hong Kong go up and down. I was in Sri Lanka not too long ago, and these guys were telling me that the price of turnips had gone up by 37% in a couple months. Turnips! Okay? Why? Quantitative easing. Money printing. I mean, I see this stuff all over the world with my own eyes. This is how central banking works. This is a busy chart, but I'm going to walk you through this. Anybody know who this lady is? Janet Yellen? Right. So she just became the Fed, I guess we call this chairperson now. Okay, so she just took over the Fed. Here's the deal, and a lot of people don't realize this, actually. So the Fed is, we've got Fed bank presidents, governors, directors, and so forth. Who picks those people? The banks. This guy. Anybody know who this guy is? Jamie Dimon. He runs J.P. Morgan. He picks who ends up on the Federal Reserve boards. The banks pick 2/3 of the seats, i.e. the controlling interest of the Federal Reserve is picked by commercial banks. Not by you, not by Obama. That guy. That guy gets to pick who has total control of the money supply, who gets to set the price of everything on the planet. That guy. Okay? So what happens? The Fed conjures money out of thin air. They loan it to the commercial banks, like Jamie Dimon, at 0% interest. Jamie Dimon turns around and loans that money to Mr. Barack. And the banks buy the U.S. debt at interest. The U.S. government issues bonds. The banks get the money from the central bank. They create money, give it to the banks give it to the government, and the government pass on all those obligations to you, the people, we, the people, the taxpayers. Taxpayers have to pay taxes back to the government pays interest back to the bank, and the banks pocket all that cash and eventually sell their bonds back to the central bank. That's how it works. And in return for that, again, we get higher taxes, higher debt, we get inflation, we get asset bubbles, we get banking crises. That is the system. That is what freedom means today in 2014. That is the system that we're living in. Remember, we're talking about change. This is a bit of a history lesson, so we're talking about all this has changed. The financial system has changed. The dominant superpower has changed. The social contract has changed. All this stuff changes throughout history, frequently. And what history tells us is that these changes are rarely smooth or peaceful. In the decline of the Roman Empire, what do they get? Attila the Hun. They got death, they got taxes, they got war, they got civil war, they got barbarian invasions, capped off by that guy who was like the worst thing to ever exist in Europe. This one down in the corner here, this is the French Revolution. When the French decided to change their system out, they traded an absolute monarchy for the genocidal dictatorship of Robespierre. And when they got tired of that, they traded that for the militaristic empire of Napoleon. In the case of the Russians again were one of the great empires, particularly in the 1700s and the 1800s, and going into the 1900s, and they had a big revolution and decided that they wanted to change. And there was a huge change there, and what do they get? They got 7 decades of communism. They got Stalin. Okay? World War II, again, this was a major issue, a turning point in the world in which there was a new superpower that emerged, there's a new financial system that emerged, and what did it take to get there? Global war. So what causes these changes? Well, you could really look at any number of factors. If you read history books about the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, the decline and fall of the Ottoman Empire, Egypt, you can go all the way back to the ancient Sumerians. At the end of the day, every one of these reasons comes down to economics. If there's a bad harvest, and people say, oh, they had a bad harvest, they had a natural disaster. If you have a strong economy, you rebuild. If you have a strong economy, you have savings. Back then, savings wasn't these pieces of paper. Savings was actually real stuff. It was grain. They had grain savings. You could rebuild. You could withstand the foreign militaries coming and invading you. You could build walls and defenses. You could do all these things because you had a strong and resilient economy. When you don't have a strong and resilient economy, you're not able to do those things anymore. You're on the decline, and you collapse. It always comes down to economics. History gives us another important lesson, is that people will deal with a lot of stuff. They will suffer through inflation. They will suffer through higher taxes. They will suffer through an erosion of their civil liberties. We'll suffer silently, we'll complain a little bit, but we'll deal with it. Because as human beings, we don't really like revolutionary change. We don't like to rock the boat. We like to keep things relatively stable. That's human nature. But the second that a man is not able to put food on the table for his family, you have a problem. Governments have a big problem. And this is a major lesson throughout history. We saw this in the Arab Spring, right? What happened? There was a Tunisian fruit merchant who was tired because he couldn't make ends meet anymore, and this guy goes out, lights himself on fire, and causes revolution across an entire region. This is what happened in France. This is what happened throughout the fall of the Roman Empire. This has happened so many times before. They get to a certain point where people just can't make ends meet. So you look at these specific economic conditions. Again, what drives those economic conditions? What drives the decline of these economies? Quite simply, it's debt. When countries get too much in debt, they run into trouble. That's some really interesting quotes here. There's one at the bottom, Larry Summers. The guy used to be the Treasury Secretary. He says, how long can the world's biggest debtor go on being the world's biggest power? It's a great question to ponder. So what happens when they get to that point? I have something I like to call the 4 Ds. Okay, when governments get too much into debt, what happens? Well, they really only have 4 options. Their primary objective is they're interested in maintaining the status quo no matter what it takes. And again, history is full of examples of governments that are trying to maintain the status quo. They deceive. They will lie through their teeth. They will look at you and say, don't worry about your Social Security. It's fine. There's a guy, Juncker, I think he was the Prime Minister of Luxembourg, got caught lying red-handed in Europe a couple years back, and he told reporters afterwards, he said, you know, you lied through your teeth. He said, well, yeah. And the quote was, when things get really serious, you have to lie. Okay, I mean, this was the same politician who was saying this. They will lie through their teeth. They will devalue their currencies. They will erode the purchasing power of the money in your pocket. I don't care what money you have. Euros, yen, pounds, dollars, pesos, doesn't matter. They will erode the purchasing power of your savings. What you worked for your entire life, they will destroy that. Anybody want to remember what the price of a dozen eggs was 20 years ago? I wrote this thing the other day about, I was shocked. I went to go visit my parents on Friday, and I popped into a grocery store, this place we used to go to all the time when I was a kid. And there's a vending machine outside, and they had a vending machine out there when I was a kid. I was 6, 7 years old, and the price of a Coca-Cola was 25 cents. Today it's $1.50. And that's an 83% decline in your purchasing power of your dollar. And if you look at the statistics of sort of real wages, median wages, and so forth, the rise in wages doesn't keep up with the rise of goods and the cost of living. There's a reason why 20, 30 years ago, my father could go out on a single income and support his wife and children. Today, you can't do that. Practically every household has to be dual income. Everybody has to go out there working just to keep their heads above water. Default is another big one. The idea of default is that when governments get too much in debt, they have obligations. Whether those are obligations to creditors, obligations to taxpayers, obligations to retirees, somebody is going to get screwed. Somebody is going to be defaulted on. Okay? Well, they can either default on their creditors, default on their debt, they can default on Social Security, they can default on any number of things. When you have all these obligations and this much money to pay it, it doesn't take a rocket science to figure out that there's no chance they're going to be able to make those payments. And the last one is actually the worst. This is the dominate. This is when they try to control everything. They impose capital controls, wage controls, price controls, media controls, gun controls, border controls, any kind of control they can possibly make just to try and keep the party going a little bit longer. This is not some wild conspiracy theory. It's uncomfortable to think about, but a lot of this stuff is already happening. We've seen this already in so many places around the world. We saw, again, last year, I think, most of the world woke up and saw what happened in Cyprus when they seized people's bank accounts and said, whoa, you could do that? Yeah, they can do that. And there have been a number of countries that have gone and they've seized pension savings, retirement savings, bank accounts, all sorts of things. I'm sure Peter will stand up here and tell you that even this idea of central banking, when you award this tiny banking elite with the ability to control the price of everything, that is a form of price control. The United States actually just recently fell to number 46 in the world in a ranking of the most free media. Number 46, right between Haiti and Romania. That's what the land of the free is today. There are tremendous social implications to all this. We can see, again, when countries get in this situation, we can see substantial inflation, resource shortages, rising crime rate, social unrest. There's a lot of really great academic analysis. These guys, Ponticelli and Voth, wrote something a couple years back about essentially linking having too much debt, linking that to social turmoil. So they looked at sort of economic decline, and as well as this paper by this Professor Wu. Really interesting data, essentially making a hard link between economic decline, too much debt, etc., and all these sort of social implications: rising crime rates, rebellion, revolution, insurrection, etc. There are serious social implications in this. The Romans were masterful at the application of these 4 Ds. Of course, Diocletian, this guy, this isn't lined up. Diocletian, all the way over here on the right. This is a guy who imposed in 301 AD his edict on wages and prices. Set the death penalty for anybody who violated his price controls. And of course it didn't work. Anytime they try and do this, it only hastens the decline. The Romans were famous at giving their peasants, bread and circuses to distract them from all the real problems that were out there in the world. It was just a form of welfare and distraction. Welfare and distraction. Keep people away from what the real problem. Don't let them think too hard about what's happening. Just keep them distracted from all the problems. These tactics are literally thousands of years old. The French, this is a very interesting case. Let me see how much time I have. The French are a very interesting case. We talked about this back in the... All right, thanks, buddy. So this is an interesting case. So the French were we talked about this in the 1600s, early 1700s. The French were by far the most powerful civilization in the world, and certainly in Europe. Under the reign of Louis XIV, l'État, c'est moi, I am the state, the absolute monarchy. Eventually, the French people thought that it was sort of their divine right to be the world's superpower. And of course, we all know that that's total nonsense. Many people think the same thing about the United States. The whole point is that everybody always thinks that they're entitled to this position. When they get into that position, they start spending more. They want to enjoy their wealthy lifestyle. The French have all these colonies all over the world. They built welfare. They built free hospitals. They built great monuments to themselves, statues, parks, all these great things, many of which are actually still standing today. And we can go to Paris and go, wow, that's really beautiful, but man, did that cost a lot of money 300-400 years ago. It was really expensive. And guess what? They couldn't afford it. They couldn't afford it. Their expenses started to rise. A little bit at first, then more and more and more, and eventually they looked around and said, hey, wait a minute, we're not generating enough revenue to cover these expenses. Oh, that's okay. We're the world's superpower. We can do whatever we want. Okay? And the French did that. And they kicked the can down the road for a really long time. The French Revolution kicked off with the storming of the Bastille, July 14, 1789. In the decade running up to that, French debt service, i.e. the amount of interest that they had to pay as a percentage of their tax revenue, increased from 30% to 62%. Oh, that's my mark. I'll speed it along. In that time, the French had devalued their currency. They had gone deeply into debt. One of the things that's really interesting is during the 7 Years' War, this was known as the French and Indian War of the United States. They were fighting the British. The 7 Years' War was sort of like a proto-World War. This is a war that took place on multiple continents against multiple belligerents. And the French were so broke, in the middle of the war, they sent their finance minister to England to beg for a loan from the guy that you're fighting. They said, well, the prevailing rate in France at that time was 10%. They said, well, we'll give you 11.5%. Yeah, what a deal, right? And, of course, the English didn't take too kind of that, but there are a lot of bankers in England who said, well, I'll take that deal. And so the English government came down and said, I will kill anybody who loans a single ounce to the French. And so what happened? The economy was weak. It had no resilience whatsoever. Throughout the 1780s, the debt service got higher and higher, and the person whose head they're holding right there, that's Louis XVI. The very interesting part about this is that prior to Louis XVI, his father, Louis XV, in the mid-1760s, the early 1760s, he knew he had a problem. He knew he had a big problem. And so he got all of his council together and he said, okay, guys, we really have to cut spending. Give me a list of all the stuff we can cut. Because at this point, we're spending 550 million livres on tax revenue of 286 million. Almost double. We can't do this anymore. We have to cut spending. Give me a list of stuff we can cut. And they came back and said, well, we can't. I don't know. I can't think of anything. Because at that point, all of their institutions were so ingrained, so culturally ingrained. They couldn't remember a time when they didn't have free health care. They couldn't remember a time when they didn't have monuments and parks. And so their pensions. Oh, God, their pensions. Their pensions were huge. An enormous burden on the state. And they couldn't remember a time when they didn't have this stuff. And they thought, well, we can't possibly do away with the pensions. Okay, well, let's cut health care. No, we can't cut health care either. That's important. It's critical. Everything was critical. They couldn't find anything to cut at all. And so they got in this position, again, late 1780s. They had one bad harvest season in the winter of 1788, and that was it. People grabbed their pitchforks and they went and stormed the Bastille. Very interesting, if you want to actually read a very, very interesting first-hand account of this, read Thomas Jefferson's personal diary. Thomas Jefferson was in Paris in July 1789. When they stormed the Bastille, Thomas Jefferson writes, well, there's all these French people going down the streets with their pitchforks. That's interesting. It's very interesting to read Thomas Jefferson's works on this. In that period, you think, great, okay, so they stormed the Bastille, they grabbed the gunpowder, they grabbed all the weapons and the armory, and they went and they said, okay, we're going to go get that king. And then what happened? And they realized, oh, wait a minute. We still have the exact same problems. Just because we changed the players doesn't mean we changed the game. We have the exact same problems as we did before. And so the king was out, they put some sort of provisional government in, and what do they get? They got hyperinflation. These guys decided that, you know what, here's the way to solve our problems. Let's print some paper currency. Up to that point, they'd used gold and silver and so forth. At that point, they decided, we'll use paper currency. Everybody said, yeah, great idea. We'll use paper currency. And everybody actually cheered that on. And at first, it was a great idea. People saw the prices of their businesses rise, the shares rise, their homes rise. Everybody felt wealthier because there's all this money in circulation. They thought, yeah, this is great. I'm making money. And then all of a sudden, there was a bifurcation point, and the system went nonlinear. And the prices of everything went up. And there's some really interesting sort of inflationary data, which we probably don't have time to go into. You can see what the prices. The great thing about the French, they kept meticulous records. This is actually a list. I'm a economic history wonk. This is actually the ledger of the French government in 1787. And they kept meticulous records. And you can go back and actually look and see the prices of everything rising throughout the 1780s, 1790s, and so forth. It was horrible what people had to deal with. And in addition to all that, so they had hyperinflation. Then they had internal civil war. They had an external war with Austria. They had an external war with Prussia. Then they elected this guy who they thought, oh, here's a guy who's going to solve all the problems. He's a great speaker. He's a great orator. His name was Maximilien Robespierre. And this guy went and waged genocide in his own country. They had more war, more civil war, more hyperinflation, rising crime rates, economic recession, economic depression. And then this other guy comes along and says, oh, there's a guy who's going to save us. And his name was Napoleon. And he went and dragged everybody into so much warfare. And the French at the time, everybody thinks Napoleon was a military genius, and not really to take anything away from his proficiency. But Napoleon's greatest advantage was there's just so many French people. And Napoleon once told his enemies, you will never beat me. I can spend 30,000 men per month. What do you have? And all these other little countries he was fighting, the Austrians, the Brits, they didn't have that kind of manpower. France was this huge nation with this huge population. Napoleon thought it was nothing to just go and expend the lives of Frenchmen, because he had something that nobody else had. In addition to these men, he was in charge of this nation state. And all these other countries, the Austrians and the Brits, etc., they were living in this monarchy. The French were actually deluded into believing that it was their country, so that they actually had more of a reason to go and fight and die. And so Napoleon thought nothing to go and send these guys to their deaths, 30,000 at a time. I should back up and just mention, from the time that the first shots were fired at the Bastille to the time that Napoleon was exiled, and he came back, then he was exiled again, and in 1815, they finally reinstated a constitutional monarch. It was a 26-year period. It was 26 years of turmoil, of inflation, of civil war, of external war. 26 years. So remember that lesson, that these changes are rarely smooth, or peaceful. The Ottoman Empire, I just love this cartoon. Ottoman Empire, similar deal. They were paying 17% of their total revenue in debt service, went up to 52% in 11 years. Then they defaulted. Big surprise. No shocker there. When you have to spend 52% of your tax revenue just to pay interest, this is what happens. In mathematics, there's a principle called exponential decay. That's what this line in the middle is. And it's what Hemingway wrote in The Sun Also Rises about going bankrupt. The phrase is typically said slowly at first and all at once, but the actual phrase in the book is gradually then suddenly. It happens gradually then suddenly. You go across that curve, nice and slow. Everybody thinks, oh, there's nothing going on here, no change. This is nice and easy. And all of a sudden it just drops off a cliff. And we've seen this in our own lifetime. The one on the right is the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union. It happened, this was 7 decades in the making, and then it happened practically overnight. The one on the left happened just, 13 years ago. This is Argentina. December 2001, people in Argentina woke up, and everything was kind of normal. They were in the middle of a recession, but things were fairly normal, okay. The unemployment rate was a little bit high, but things were relatively normal. Within a matter of days, they collapsed, they defaulted on their debt, the currency collapsed, the government had collapsed, they went through a number of the police were out in the street shooting people in the face, there were riots, looting, power went out, everything. All this happened in a matter of days. It's the exact same principles. They're all running completely unsustainable budgets, completely unsustainable monetary systems, and the collapse came in a matter of days. So to review briefly again, we're talking about the world superpower constantly changing, the principal social contract always changing, the monetary system always changing, and these changes, again, are rarely smooth or peaceful. And again, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that the path to prosperity is not paved in money that you print out of thin air or going deeper into debt. This is not the path to prosperity. Higher taxes, more regulation, this is not what creates prosperity. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure that out. So let's look at debt. This is what's happening today. These two columns are essentially 2011 and 2013. The French go from 99 to 116%. This is a percentage of their GDP. Italy, 130 to 143. Japan, 204 to 237. The Japanese are already spending 25% of their tax revenue just to pay interest on the debt. 25% of every single yen that they collect goes just to pay interest. And interest rates in Japan are basically zero. And they're spending 25% of their tax revenue. This is the 3rd largest economy in the world. So you can see these numbers are getting worse and worse and worse. And this is only a 2-year period. In the United States, this is all publicly available information. Again, this isn't any tinfoil hat stuff. This is all publicly available information. The government's own numbers. The GAO reports every year they do this thing. They actually put together financial statements for the United States. That's what they call them. Of course, they get to use their own accounting methods. If they use the accounting methods that you and I would have to use in private businesses, these numbers would be even worse. But using government accounting methods, in 2011, they're negative equity. All their assets, the highway system, every tank, every bullet, every tree in a national park, they add up all the assets and subtract the liabilities, minus $14.7 trillion in 2011. 2012, it went up. 2013, it went up. It keeps going up. Now it's basically $17 trillion in negative equity. That's subtracting out the assets. So even if you count the value of the highway system, and if you count the military, and you count all these things, they're still in the whole $17 trillion. This is not a figure that anybody should just ignore and say, oh, that's no big deal. Because that's exactly what everybody else through history did. They said, well, there won't be any consequences here because we're special, we're different. That's what everybody said. Nobody's special. Nobody is special. In 2013, they took in $2.6 trillion in taxes. They spent $2.5 just in interest and mandatory spending. Before they allocated $1 for the military, for the light bill at the White House. They had already blown through $2.5 trillion on tax revenue of $2.6. How long can they keep that up? This is well past the point of no return. Anecdotally, the point of no return is when you have to borrow money to pay interest on the money you've already borrowed. It's very simple. If you or I were in that situation, if you're drowning in debt, you make a little bit of money, you've got huge debts, huge, interest bills, you think you're going to be able to get a loan? Maybe Robert can hook you up with a mortgage, but it's really hard. You can't keep that going. And even in the most optimistic government projections, the rate of growth of their debt level exceeds the rate of growth for the entire economy. Again, it just is only going to get worse. There are consequences of this. Again, the United States now spends more on its gross interest than it does the military. How long can you be the world superpower when you spend more on interest than you do your military? This is a picture of the Spanish-American War. This is a war essentially where Spain was in a tremendously weak position. They had a bunch of colonies in the Western Hemisphere, as well as in the Philippines. The United States really wanted to grab. Spain was broke. They were completely broke. They couldn't defend themselves anymore. They couldn't defend their colonies. And the United States was able to go to war. At this point, was a rising power on the world stage, sort of in the same position that China is now. And when they went to war, they just wrote a check. The U.S. was so rich back then, they could finance the whole war. They didn't have to raise taxes. They didn't have to borrow any money. They just wrote a check for the war. That was the position that the U.S. was in 1898. You think they could do that today? No, they can't. The U.S. is too broke for war. Too broke. They wanted to go and invade Syria, couldn't do that. And they blame Putin for it, but the reality is they can't afford it. They can't afford it. The British were in the same position during the Suez Crisis in the 1950s. In the 1950s, they nationalized the Suez Canal, and the Brits had a lot of interest in that region. They said, oh, we're going to go down there, and we're going to clean that up, and so on. And they looked at their finances and said, oh, wait a minute, we can't afford this. We don't have a penny to allocate to this. This is what happens. This momentum has been building for decades. This is a history of U.S. deficits going all the way back to 1940. You don't see a whole lot of green there. And all this is made possible by a number of things. One, Ponzi finance within the U.S. government. This chart here, this is the amount of U.S. treasuries that are owned by the Social Security Administration. This is the only way they keep financing their debt is by borrowing from retirees. This is money that's supposed to go to retirees. And now it's sitting and the Treasury takes this and they go and blow it on drones and bombs and all this stuff. This is money that has been paid into the system for decades that's supposed to go to retirees. That's the promise that they've made to people. They've looked you in the eye and said, don't worry, your Social Security is fine, you're going to get it, and this is what they do with it. There's also the continued generosity of foreigners. This is foreigners that have been owning U.S. debt. It's gone up and up and up and up. And you notice this little circle here, this tiny little dip here. There's a new trend that all of a sudden foreigners are starting to dump their treasuries. The Chinese are now dumping U.S. treasuries in record numbers. The Russians are dumping U.S. treasuries in record numbers. How long can we think that's going to last? The continued long-term expansion of the Federal Reserve. This is the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. I mean, it barely registers, even back in 2003, 2004, 2008, and all of a sudden it just skyrockets. What does this mean? This is the amount of money that they're printing. This is the amount of money that they're just conjuring out of thin air. And you see the little circle here? This is back, 2012, 2013, when the politicians told us, oh, everything's good now. We're out of recession. This is smooth sailing. Does this look like smooth sailing? Does that look like recovery? This is hockey stick right here. That's a hockey stick. That's not recovery. Same deal. Manipulation of the, Right. This is a manipulation of the mortgage market. This is a real estate crowd. Just find this interesting. These are mortgage-backed securities that are owned by the Fed. They talk about housing recovery, right? Why is there a housing recovery? Because the Federal Reserve is printing money and they're buying these mortgages from the banks. Again, here they said, oh, look, the housing market's okay. The housing market's flattened out. Everything's good. We're in recovery. Same deal. Does that look like recovery? The only recovery is because the Fed is printing money. How is that recovery? The total manipulation of commercial banking. The Fed's in a position now where they loan money at 0% to commercial banks, and then they pay interest to commercial banks for holding accounts on reserve. And again, cheered on by our faux scientists who receive society's most esteemed prize in intellectual achievement for telling us, that's great. You know, Krugman was the guy who said, oh, we should fake a space alien invasion, and that'll get us out of recession. He's the guy who says, you know, they say, what do you think about all this money printing at the Fed? You know, the expansion of their balance sheet to over $4 trillion. He said, they're not printing enough. This guy won the Nobel Prize. And a 6-year-old can figure this out. That doesn't make any sense. But our scientists tell us that it's okay. The U.S. government has been able to enjoy these benefits. It's been able to pawn off our debt on foreign governments. It's been able to do all these things because the U.S. government has been cashing in on credibility and goodwill that was earned by previous generations. Generations that fought the Nazis. Generations that actually built factories in America. Those are the generations that did those things, and the U.S. government has been cashing in on that credibility for decades. But the goodwill is vanishing very quickly. When you go and you spy on your allies, when you devalue the reserve currency faster than anybody can possibly predict, those are the sorts of things that don't really win you any friends out there on the world stage. And everybody knows it. So with all these things, I mean, this is what they do. They solve problems caused by too much money in the system. What do? They print more money. They solve problems caused by too much debt. What do? They increase their debt. You know, they reduce unemployment. Everybody really looks at the unemployment numbers. Again, this is sort of wonky financial stuff. You know, but the labor force participation rate is at multi-decade lows. What does that mean? They just stopped counting people. When they say the unemployment rate is X, they just, you know, they just decrease the denominator. That's all they're doing. They say, oh, look, the unemployment rate went down. Yeah, that's because you're not counting millions of people. It's as simple as that. You know, and when they create jobs, what do? They expand the size of government. You know, they advertise for jobs on the backs of pizza boxes, you know, so that guys can go and, you know, and fondle me at the airport. That's, you know, that's the employment. That's the productive employment that they're creating in the land of the free. They balance the budget. President Obama just released his fiscal year 2015 budget. And you look at it, he says, oh, we're saving trillions of dollars, we're reducing the deficit by trillions of dollars. Funny thing about that is they consider, you know, a budget deficit of only $700 billion to be, you know, that's a good news story. But all the budget cuts are like in 2020, 2022, 2024. Those are when the cuts come in. So, you know, they get to, all the congressmen, all the senators, they all get to say, oh yeah, we're cutting the budget, But, you know, we don't have to accept any of the political consequences of that today. We can just push all that stuff out into the future. So we can say that, you know, we're tough on our fiscal, being fiscally conservative, etc. But they don't have to deal with any of the consequences. These people are raising taxes. They're spying on everybody. They're dropping bombs by remote control. They're authorizing the military detention of citizens on U.S. soil. They pass these absurd laws and regulations that have basically created a system in which everybody in this room is guilty of some sort of victimless crime. You can't even apply for a passport now without being threatened with imprisonment. I was watching this movie the other day, and at the end of the movie, you know, there's that FBI warning. You know, it says, oh, unlawful, this, that, and the other. It's like, I can't even watch a movie without being threatened with imprisonment in the land of the free. And they empower these police agencies to run wild. The Fish and Wildlife Service has its own police agency. There are literally hundreds of police agencies within the federal government, offices that nobody's even ever heard of, and there's these guys, these gun-toting badge holders that get to go, and the guys in the Fish and Wildlife Service going and kicking in doors and throwing people to the ground with guns. I mean, this is absurd. You know, again, spying on everybody. I mean, this is what it's come to. But all these policies really only hasten the end game. They ultimately only make things worse. So, Gwen, this is just a quick review. We're in a position now where central banks, I should say, are basically almost insolvent. The growth in debt levels in the wealthy, rich Western nations is exceeding the growth of their economies. Governments are having to borrow money just to pay interest, and that's at interest rates at all-time lows. What happens to the amount of money that they have to pay in interest when interest rates actually rise? We have to really look at all this stuff from a historical context and wonder, are we really any different? All these things, unsustainable finances, currency debasement, the expansion of the state, overregulation, military fatigue, the erosion of freedom. This is not the first time that we've seen this throughout history. Every great civilization has always come into this position, and the consequences are almost always the same. When the symptoms are the same, we really have to look at this objectively and think, are we any different? Here's a funny thing about revolution. If you look up revolution in the dictionary, there's two definitions. One is this idea of major political change. The Arab Spring, the Great Egyptian, the American, so forth, all these revolutions, right? The other is from a celestial perspective. When the earth makes one revolution around the sun, what happens? It ends up right back where it started. That is the nature of revolution. And when people say, oh, we're just going to go and vote those guys out, you end up right back where you started. Political revolution, you end up right back where you started. Egypt is a great example, right? They kicked out a dictator. What do they get? A military dictator. They kicked him out. What do they get? A civilian dictator. They keep ending up, all they're doing is changing the players, not the game. And nothing fundamentally changes until the game changes, not the players. So any of these things about, let's do a grassroots political movement, etc., those solutions don't work because they're all about changing the players. There's a great book by this guy's an anthropologist, an academic, not a conspiracy theorist, not a tinfoil hat guy. His name is Joseph Tainter. I've got a little bibliography at the end. I'll show you. But this guy says, collapse, if and when it comes again, will this time be global. No longer can any individual nation collapse. World civilization will disintegrate as a whole. That sounds really gloomy, right? We'll get to the good news. This is the exponential decay curve. This is probably one of the most important charts I could show you, because you never know where you are along this curve. Are you at the beginning? Are you in the middle? Are you right on the precipice? We don't know. We have no idea. All we know is that if we look at the trends objectively, if we look at the data objectively, and we check all, we're all sort of programmed from the time that we're born. We go through a publicly funded school system and so forth, and we're all programmed to think it can never happen here. We're the greatest. We're the greatest. Again, everybody throughout history thought the same thing. But if sort of completely objective, benevolent space aliens showed up tomorrow, and we just handed them all the data, what do you think they would say? They'd say, "Oh, you guys are screwed," right? But we just don't know. We know the trend's going here, but we don't know where we are along this curve. Again, questions you have to ask. I talked about this briefly. I mentioned this point about the insolvency of central banks. I won't get into what that actually means and how we calculate this, essentially, but the Federal Reserve, like any bank, has what they call a margin of safety. Okay, this is the bank's equity, its assets minus liabilities. You guys are smart real estate people. You understand what that means. The Fed's equity as a percentage of its assets has been on an astounding decline. And again, here is when they said, oh yeah, the recovery's in. The recovery's in. Started to flatten out. And then what? Cratered. Again, does this look like recovery? How low does this go before there's a currency crisis? How high does this get? U.S. debt as a percentage of GDP. How high does that get before there's a sovereign debt crisis? There are not that many options. We talked about default. They could default on their creditors. Way too many obligations, not enough money. It is not rocket science. And they can look at this and say, all right, we can default on our creditors. The Chinese, we can make them out to be the enemy. We'll just default on the Chinese. That's not particularly risky from a political perspective. They can default on any number of people. But when they default on their foreign creditors, the entire U.S. financial system is based on the credibility of the U.S. government. You destroy that, the entire financial system goes away. They can default on the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve owns trillions of dollars of U.S. Treasury. You default on the Federal Reserve, that number I just showed you 2 charts ago, that goes negative. You create a currency crisis. They can default on retirees. Social Security Administration owns trillions of dollars of U.S. Treasuries. Could default on those. Or other obligations to taxpayers. All the things they've been promising you They say, well, you know what, we're just not going to be able to do that. All the money that you're paying, you think you're paying for roads and this and that, whatever, you're not paying for that anymore. Now you're paying for debt, and only debt. And then you've got the devaluation side, significant reduction in your purchasing power, foreign nations that panic, head for the exits. Who would want to hold the dollar anymore when they know it's just going to keep going down and down and down? Never forget, we're talking about crises, banking crises, currency crises, etc. This is who you're dealing with. Okay, these are the fellow countrymen. People are going to rip themselves to pieces for gym towels that cost $1.99. And don't forget about these guys too. That's also who you're dealing with. Most people are going to do this. Because we've been programmed from the time that we were born to believe that it's never going to happen here. That we're different, that we're special, and these guys are going to figure it all out. Now here's the good news. You guys ready for good news? He's coming back. I've actually got him on the line. Hold on. Steve Jobs used to write. He talked about something that happened when he was a kid. He read an article in Scientific American when he was a kid, and he said this really profoundly affected him as a child. In the article, the author was writing about the efficiency of locomotion of particular animals. Essentially, how many calories does an animal expend getting from point A to point B? And they looked at all these different species, frogs and cheetahs and chimpanzees, human beings, and the one that ranked way above the top was the condor. Expended the fewest calories getting from point A to point B. And human beings were mediocre at best. But the author of the article had the foresight to also look at a human being on a bicycle. And a human being on a bicycle blew every other species out of the water by a massive margin. And Steve Jobs looked at that, and that profoundly affected him, because to him, it created this idea in his mind that human beings are fundamentally tool creators. Because we talk about all these trends, all these charts, debt's going this, and equity's going that, and all these things, right? But the greatest trend in the history of the world is lesson number 5. This is the ascent of man. Human beings, humanity is the one universal, long-term winning trend. You never go wrong betting on human beings as a whole. We are awesome. Despite the leadership that we have, we manage to fix all the problems that they get us into. Sometimes it's painful, sometimes there's turmoil, but we fix it, we adjust, we adapt, we overcome, we improve, we move on. The most important thing, I think, in terms of a solution, is to accept that you're not crazy because you can see the truth. Just because you think that debt, printing money, higher taxes, etc., just because you think that's not the path to prosperity, doesn't mean that you're a tinfoil hat-wearing, nutty conspiracy theorist. You're not crazy because you can look at numbers and data objectively and go, oh, that's actually kind of a problem. When you have to borrow money just to pay interest, you're not crazy because you can look at that. And that's the most important thing. People go home, they talk to their friends and their neighbors, and people go, oh, you're nuts. You get told you're crazy enough times, you start to believe it. One very important conclusion here is to look at this from a very big picture and think that if nearly every single objective fundamental in your home country suggests that your country is in terminal decline, maybe it's time to make sure that all of your eggs are not in one basket. Again, look at the data objectively. Make a rational decision, not an emotional decision, not the decision because of what you've been programmed to believe. Look at the numbers and make a decision for yourself. If every bit of data tells you the trend is that, maybe it's time to do something. If your country's headed south, then start moving things around to other countries. This strategy is nothing new. People have literally been doing this for thousands of years. The really good news is that it's easier than ever now. You don't have to put, huge, bars of gold on wagons and send them, over the Silk Road or anything. I mean, you can sit in your underwear in your living room and make a few clicks with your mouse. and make things happen. It's really becoming so much easier than it ever has been. I would encourage you, consider moving a portion of your savings overseas to a strong and very stable bank, especially if you have a lot of retirement savings in the land of the free. And this goes for anybody. I don't care where you're from. If you're from Canada, England, the United States, it doesn't matter. Look at the objectives, the objective fundamentals of your home country. You know, the math is the same. So do consider moving a portion of your savings abroad. There are plenty of great places in the world where the banks are actually strong, the banks are solvent, where they've never had a banking crisis, where they've never had a bank failure, where they're not depending on handouts from central banks. There are plenty of places in the world. Think very carefully about which currencies you denominate your savings in. If you're going to hold paper currency, think very carefully about which currencies those are. I've looked at this really hard. I've crunched all the numbers. I will tell you objectively, we won't go into the math here, but the safest currency in the world is the Norwegian krone. Norwegian krone is like a cockroach. There could be, nuclear war in the financial system, and the Norwegian krone is going to be just fine. It's going to crawl out from its little hole, and it's going to be just fine. The Hong Kong dollar is a very safe option. The reason why is because the Hong Kong dollar is a very well-capitalized currency. The Hong Kong Monetary Authority is a very well-capitalized central bank. Okay, that chart we showed of the Fed's equity, that margin of safety, that doesn't apply in Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, it's going like this, the opposite direction, going up. But the nice thing about the Hong Kong dollar is it's pegged to the U.S. dollar. So if you're a U.S. dollar investor and you don't want to take any currency risk, you invest in krones, maybe krones go down, maybe they go up, you don't want to really take that kind of risk. Own Hong Kong dollars. Because the Hong Kong dollar is pegged to the U.S. dollar. Very, very tight float. Very tight float. And so if the U.S. dollar goes up, the Hong Kong dollar goes up. If the U.S. dollar suddenly collapses, guess what? The Hong Kong Monetary Authority says, well, that peg was a lot of fun, but you can have it back now. And so now your money's safe. I always consider, I would encourage people to look at residency in a foreign country. This is a really radical idea that makes some people uncomfortable. But again, history is full of examples of times when people had their backs against the wall in an entire nation and thought, well, I got to get out of here. It happens. Okay, I'm not telling you it is going to happen. I'm not telling you the date that it's going to happen or anything like that. But it makes a little bit of sense, particularly if you have a family, you have kids to worry about. At least consider your options. If I ever had to leave, where would I go? You don't want to start having that conversation while you're packing your bags. You want to know in advance. I would encourage folks to, this is an easy one for this crowd, I want to encourage folks to own more real assets, fewer paper assets. We've seen so many instances, the MF Global meltdown, all the things we learned, the investing world learned all these crazy terms, hypothecation, reverse hypothecation. Turns out if you're investing in stock, you don't actually own those stocks. Your broker owns those stocks. They keep an internal ledger in your name, for the most part. So paper assets definitely get out of control. Real assets is something that's very difficult to take away. Gold, real estate, etc. I'm really big on agricultural property, which I guess we'll talk about tomorrow. Definitely expand your thinking beyond your home country. It's so great that we're on this cruise ship. We're going to Belize. We're going to Honduras. Very, very good thing to look at the opportunities beyond your home country. A lot of people think, we're all sort of programmed to believe that the only opportunities exist where we're from. That's not true. There's a whole world of opportunity out there, and there's some really great ones. Think very differently about businesses and investments. I don't have to say that to this crowd again. It's a very real estate-oriented crowd. A lot of people just think stocks, bonds, mutual funds, and that's it. They can't really think anything beyond that. Private businesses, real estate, precious metals, direct ownership in commodities, etc. These are sorts of things, again, outside of the norm, but it makes sense to look at those things right now. And there's a lot of other options. I won't get into all of these, but the whole point is that ranging from where you store your gold to having other passports to moving your retirement account overseas, privacy, lifestyle opportunities overseas, medical insurance, all these things that we're talking about, moving a portion of your savings, having at least thinking about residency, all this stuff makes sense no matter what. If you have a little bit of savings in a strong, stable bank overseas, how are you worse off? How are you worse off? In what way are you hurt because you've got, $100,000 in cash sitting in a bank account overseas that nobody can touch, it's not going to collapse, etc.? How are you worse off for that? You're not. All this stuff makes sense no matter what. How are you worse off because you have a good idea of where you would go in case you ever needed to leave the country? How are you worse off because you've gone through the steps of obtaining legal residency in that country? How are you worse off? You're not. And that's the important thing with all of this. A couple more. In any situation, there's always winners and losers. This is a slide. This is during the episode of Weimar hyperinflation. The reason I put this on, there's a really great story. Again, I read all this sort of wonky financial stuff. I've looked through all this data. But I read a book recently that wasn't about data. It was about personal stories during this hyperinflationary episode in the Weimar Republic when you had to take a wheelbarrow full of cash just to buy a loaf of bread. And these are personal stories. And one of the stories I read was a guy went to the police station and he said, officers, I had a wheelbarrow full of cash, and somebody stole it. And they said, well, we'll be able to track him down. That's not a problem. We won't miss anybody, with a wheelbarrow full of cash run away from your house. He said, no. He took the wheelbarrow. He left the cash. True story. In any situation, there are always winners and losers. The people that put their heads in the sand and ignore all the obvious signs around them, they're usually losers. People who see the writing on the wall, they take steps in advance. They move their money around, they set things up, they prepare, they're rational. Those are the winners. And this is fundamentally, I believe, an extraordinary opportunity. Living today is an amazing opportunity. I think it's a gift. This goes back to the time machine. If I gave you a time machine and said, here you go, I'm setting this to Paris, 1787. Knowing everything that you know, I said, here's your time machine, here's a textbook of the French Revolution. You would have the playbook to know exactly what to do, where to go, who to see, where to invest, everything. You would know everything. And what an amazing opportunity that would be for you if you had that power. And yet, we basically have the same opportunity. Now, there are 93 billion people who have lived in the history of the world that are trying to tell us what's going to happen. And I really appreciate everybody listening, and that you're one of the few, some of the few that are actually listening to those 93 billion people. So thanks very much.